People have always looked for patterns, answers, and meaning. That's what our brains are wired to do. When lightning struck the ground and fires broke out in ancient forests, the earliest humans didn't understand why, but they needed a story, so they created one. The sky wasn't just angry, it was a god. The rain wasn't just water, it was a gift. The sun wasn't just a star, it was something watching over them. The moment humans became self-aware enough to ask, "Why are we here?" was also the moment fear took root. Fear of the unknown, fear of death, fear of meaninglessness. And out of that fear, religion was born. Not as a revelation, but as a coping mechanism. This wasn't a divine communication, it was guesswork. Early societies created gods that looked like them, thought like them, punished like them, rewarded like them. These gods had human moods. They could be jealous, angry, forgiving, or vengeful. They needed sacrifices, temples, and endless praise. In other words, they behaved suspiciously like the people who invented them. Every ancient culture had its own creation myth. The Babylonians believed the world was formed from the corpse of a defeated goddess. The Greeks thought the gods lived on a mountain and meddled in human affairs out of boredom or spite. The Norse imagined a giant cosmic tree connecting all realms. These myths weren't isolated stories. They were belief prints for belief systems that gave people structure, order, and authority. But none of these stories came from a god. They came from human minds trying to explain a reality too complex and chaotic to understand without narrative. Over time, the stories became traditions. The traditions became doctrines, and the doctrines became untouchable. The more people invested in them, the more dangerous it became to question them. Religions evolved alongside civilizations. As empires grew, religion became a tool for political power. Pharaohs claimed they were gods. Kings said their authority came from heaven. Rulers used religion to justify wars, conquests, slavery, and control. If you disagreed with them, you weren't just wrong, you were a heretic. And that made you an enemy not just of the state, but of the divine. This wasn't about truth, it was about obedience. Even the most widely followed religions today are based on ancient texts written by people who lived in isolated tribal societies. These people didn't understand disease, astronomy, or biology. They thought illness came from demons and the stars were holes in the sky. They weren't receiving cosmic messages. They were recording their best guesses about how the world worked, wrapped in metaphors, myths, and rules for survival. And those guesses stuck. Not because they were accurate, but because they were useful. Religion gave people comfort in death, a sense of belonging, and a reason to behave. But it also came with baggage, intolerance, fear, guilt, and blind submission. People didn't stop to ask whether the stories were true, they asked whether the stories worked. Even when religions contradicted each other, the basic formula stayed the same. A powerful being watches everything, rewards the faithful, punishes the disobedient, and promises something better after death. This idea was easy to sell because it addressed our deepest fears: loneliness, uncertainty, and mortality. But just because an idea is comforting doesn't make it true. Religion claims to answer the question science is still working on. How did the universe begin? What happens after death? Why are we conscious? But these answers are packaged in old language and dogmatic thinking. They require no evidence, only belief, and that belief is protected by emotional walls, rituals, taboos, and threats. Once belief becomes sacred, it becomes unchallengeable, and when something can't be questioned, it becomes dangerous. Over time, the world has become more connected. Cultures mix, ideas spread, scientific discoveries continue to replace ancient assumptions, and yet religion still lingers, not because it keeps proving itself, but because it keeps adapting. It rebrands, it softens its edges, it incorporates new language, but the foundation remains the same: authority without evidence. What's more revealing is how similar religious systems are across history. Polytheism and monotheism aren't opposites, they're different strategies for organizing power. In both cases, you have a divine structure that grants legitimacy to rules, leaders, and institutions. Whether it's Zeus or Yahweh, Odin or Allah, the concept remains. Someone higher is watching, and you are accountable not just to laws, but to beliefs. Religion didn't fall from the sky, it was built, brick by brick, story by story, by people who wanted to make sense of life, justify their rule, or guide their communities. And like any human creation, it carries the fingerprints of its creators: tribalism, superstition, hierarchy, and fear. That's why religious texts reflect the prejudices of their time. They contain misogyny, slavery, violence, and ignorance, not because a god inspired them, but because the people who wrote them lived in brutal, unjust societies. These texts weren't ahead of their time, they were products of it, and yet billions still treat them as timeless truth. Take the concept of sin. It's not a natural law, it's a social invention. Sin isn't just about morality, it's about control. Once you convince people they're broken by default, you can sell them salvation. And if that salvation is only available through one path, one book, one leader, then you have a monopoly on meaning. That's not spirituality. That's marketing. We've made enormous progress in understanding the world, evolution, neurology, cosmology, but many still prefer stories written when people thought the earth was flat and disease was a punishment. Why? Because those stories provide certainty, and humans crave certainty, even if it's false. But progress doesn't come from certainty. It comes from doubt, from asking better questions, from admitting we don't know everything and being okay with that. The idea that a supernatural being created the universe, selected a group of people, dictated rules, punished enemies, and now watches over everything sounds less like a universal truth and more like a myth, passed through generations until it hardened into dogma. We don't treat other ancient beliefs with the same respect. No one sacrifices goats to guarantee a good harvest. No one prays to the sun for fertility. Those were once sacred too, but they faded, not because someone disproved them, but because culture moved on. Religion persists because it taps into our psychology. It offers community, purpose, ritual, and meaning, but those needs can be met without superstition. We can build ethics through empathy, not fear. We can find connection without hierarchy. We can create meaning without mythology. The gods didn't create us, we created them, because we were scared, curious, and desperate for order. And now that we understand more, we owe it to ourselves to question what we've inherited. There is no shame in recognizing that religion was humanity's first draft at understanding life, but it's a draft filled with errors. The problem comes when we treat that draft as the final version. Belief without evidence is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability. The fact that so many religions contradict each other but claim absolute truth should be enough to raise suspicion. If any one of them were clearly correct, the others wouldn't survive. But they do. Because belief isn't based on truth. It's based on repetition, emotion, identity, and fear. We don't need to be afraid anymore. We can honor our ancestors without repeating their mistakes. We can appreciate myths without living by them. We can respect tradition without submitting to it. Religion is not a divine gift. It is a human invention, born out of confusion, sustained by fear, and passed down through obedience. But like every invention, it can be retired. When we stop mistaking old stories for eternal truths, we free ourselves to write new ones based not on what we fear, but on what we know and what we can become. And what we can become is not limited by the boundaries of ancient belief. Our potential doesn't need to be filtered through dogma. It doesn't need approval from an invisible overseer. It needs curiosity, compassion, and courage. The very things religion once tried to explain, life, death, morality, are now better understood through evidence, reason, and shared human experience. Some argue that without religion, people would lose their moral compass, but morality existed long before Scripture. We see it in animals, cooperation, empathy, reciprocity. Morality is part of our evolution. It's what helped us survive as a species. And when we understand that kindness, fairness, and empathy are useful for everyone, not because we fear hell, but because they build stronger communities, we don't need commandments carved in stone. We've already replaced religion in so many parts of life. We don't rely on prayer to cure disease, we use medicine. We don't ask priests to predict weather, we use satellites. We don't consult holy texts for laws, we use constitutions and courts. The places where religion once ruled are now managed by human knowledge. So why should we keep pretending that ancient myths hold the final answers to our biggest question? The truth is, we hold on to religion not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Because letting go feels like betrayal to our families, our cultures, our past selves. But growth always begins with discomfort. And asking hard questions is not betrayal, it's bravery. Every religion teaches obedience, but progress comes from rebellion, from asking, what if this isn't true? And following the evidence wherever it leads. Not just because we want to be right, but because we want to be free. Free to think, free to choose, free to build a better world, not one promised in an afterlife, but one that exists here and now. Religious belief thrives on early indoctrination. Most people follow the religion they were born into, not because they chose it after careful comparison, but because they were never taught to question it. Belief becomes a default setting, and that's why it feels so real. But reality doesn't care how we were raised. It only cares about what's actually true. When we start questioning those default settings, the world gets bigger, the lines blur, things become uncertain, but they also become honest. And in that honesty, we find something stronger than blind faith. We find clarity. There's no evidence that any god ever spoke to humans, but there's overwhelming evidence that humans have been speaking for gods for thousands of years, writing for them, fighting for them, killing for them, and rarely, if ever, stopping to ask whether the voice they heard was divine or just their own. Religious stories often come with promises, eternal life, divine justice, cosmic love, but they also come with threats, eternal punishment, damnation, judgment. The offer of heaven means nothing without the fear of hell. And both are tools of manipulation, carrots and sticks wrapped in holy language. You're taught to feel broken, then offered a cure. You're told you're sinful, then promised forgiveness, but only if you obey. That's not spiritual guidance, that's psychological conditioning. There's a reason religions target the vulnerable, the grieving, the lonely, the desperate. People at their lowest are more open to hope, any kind of hope, even if it comes wrapped in myth, even if it demands their loyalty, their money, their silence. And once someone's inside, it becomes harder to leave. Social pressure, guilt, fear of eternal consequences, they all build a cage. And the longer someone stays, the more their identity wraps around the bars. But there is a way out, and it doesn't require new dogma or another belief system. It requires honesty, intellectual honesty, the willingness to say, I don't know, instead of pretending to know the unknowable. That's not weakness, that's integrity. Religion claims to answer everything. But it's the kind of answer that stops you from asking more, the kind of answer that ends curiosity. That's not an answer, it's an escape. We've come far as a species. We've decoded the human genome, landed robots on Mars, split atoms, connected continents with information. Yet many of us still look to books written by desert tribes thousands of years ago for moral guidance. That gap between knowledge and belief is not harmless. It shapes education, it influences policy, it fuels conflict, it slows progress, because when belief outweighs evidence, reason becomes the enemy. Religion didn't begin with gods, it began with people. Scared, curious, imaginative people, and they made stories to cope. Stories that grew into systems, systems that turned into institutions. Institutions that demanded loyalty. And they succeeded, not because they were true, but because they offered structure in a chaotic world. But we're not in that world anymore. We don't need myths to explain thunder. We don't need scriptures to tell us killing is wrong. We don't need divine permission to be good to each other. We are capable of building meaning on our own. And the fact that we can do that, without gods, without threats, without promises of paradise, is what makes us truly human. The idea that religion was invented by humans is not controversial when you look at it closely. Every religion has a birth date, a founder, a history, a set of texts written by human hands. It's not mystical, it's cultural, it's historical. And once we stop pretending otherwise, we can start focusing on the kind of future we actually want. A future based on truth, not tradition. A future shaped by evidence, not superstition. A future where meaning is made, not imposed. No God wrote religion, we did. And that should be a reason for hope. Because if we made it, we can unmake it. And if we unmake it, we can build something better, together. We can build something that values curiosity over conformity. Something that rewards questions instead of punishing them. Something that doesn't rely on ancient fear to hold modern minds hostage. We don't need invisible authorities to live moral, meaningful lives. We need education, empathy, and the courage to admit when we're wrong. Those things come from progress, not prophecy. Many people say religion gives them peace, but peace that depends on fantasy isn't peace, it's avoidance. Real peace comes from facing reality, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Life has uncertainty. It has suffering. It has mystery. But those things don't make us weak. They make us human. And being human doesn't require worship. It requires awareness. There's a quiet strength in admitting we don't have all the answers. It's what pushes science forward. It's what fuels discovery. It's what leads to real understanding, not recycled beliefs. The stories we tell shape how we live. And when those stories are based on fear, guilt, and blind loyalty, they shrink our world. They limit who we can become. But when we build our worldview on evidence, on logic, on shared human values, we grow. We connect. We evolve. Religion was an early attempt, our first step, but we're not at the beginning anymore. Holding on to ancient stories doesn't make us faithful. It makes us stagnant, and no progress ever came from staying still. The fact that religion still holds so much influence shows how powerful ideas can be, even when they're wrong. That's why it's important to ask, where did these ideas come from? Who benefits from them? And why are we still protecting them? There are thousands of gods people have worshipped throughout history. They've all had their followers, their temples, their rituals, but almost all of them have faded. Not because they were disproven, just forgotten. The gods of today are no different. They only seem permanent because we keep repeating their stories. But repetition doesn't make something true. It just makes it familiar. Familiar isn't the same as factual. Comfort isn't the same as clarity. Belief isn't the same as truth. The more you study religion, the more human it becomes. The language, the structure, the motives. It all reflects our psychology, not divine intervention. Religion tells us we're broken. It then offers to fix us. But we were never broken to begin with. We were curious. We were afraid. And we tried to make sense of things the best we could. That's not sin. That's survival. Today we have better tools, better data, better methods. We don't need to cling to ancient guesses when we have modern knowledge. People often say religion gives life meaning. Meaning isn't something given. It's something created. And the most powerful meaning is the one you build yourself, not the one handed to you with threats and promises. We owe it to ourselves to move forward, and to think for ourselves, to question what we were told, and to do it without fear. Because fear has been religion's strongest weapon. Fear of death, fear of punishment, fear of being alone. But you don't need religion to face those fears. You need truth. You need honesty. You need the willingness to see the world as it is, not as a storybook told you it should be. Religion wasn't created by a god. It was created by people just like us. People who didn't know what we now know. People who were doing their best to explain a world they couldn't understand. Now we understand more. And that understanding gives us a choice to keep pretending or to move on. Moving on doesn't mean disrespecting the past. It means learning from it and refusing to be trapped by it. We can live moral, joyful, compassionate lives without pretending that ancient texts hold all the answers. We can face the unknown without inventing stories to make it feel smaller. And we can finally stop worshiping the tools we once used because now we've outgrown them. Religion was a product of our past, but it doesn't have to be part of our future. That future is ours to build, not by gods, but by people awake, aware, and unafraid.